Nolan Briggs only learned he had voluntarily resigned when his employee badge stopped working outside the most important meeting of his career. CEO Victoria Carrington set the paperwork on the table in front of him, a resignation letter bearing what appeared to be his own signature, and calmly instructed security to escort the single father out of the company he had served for 16 years. Nolan didn't beg. He looked at the stolen signature and said, "You just fired the wrong man." 1 hour later, the boardroom doors opened. The company's lead attorney stood up and announced that Nolan controlled the largest voting bloc in the room. Before the day ended, Victoria lost her seat, and he took the chair at the head of the table. Stay until the end to find out which clause in the corporate charter that forged letter triggered. The morning Nolan Briggs arrived at Vanguard Sterling Industries' main campus in Fairmont Harbor, Ohio, he was carrying a 47-page presentation he had spent the last 10 days building from scratch, a plan he believed could save 2 operating factories and more than 3,000 jobs. He had parked his weathered pickup in the same corner of the employee lot he always used, walked the same side entrance he had used since his first week as a line engineer 16 years ago, and pressed his badge to the reader the way he had done thousands of times before. The reader blinked red. He tried again. A security officer he recognized from years of morning shifts stepped forward and told him, with obvious discomfort, that his access had been deactivated. Nolan assumed it was a system error, the kind that happened after software updates, and asked to speak to someone in IT. Curtis Bellamy, the company's director of human resources, appeared at the lobby door within minutes. Too quickly, Nolan would later think, for it to have been coincidental, and led him not toward the IT desk but toward a small conference room on the ground floor that was rarely used for anything except terminations. The room held a circular table, 4 chairs, a water pitcher, and 2 people Nolan had not expected. Victoria Carrington, seated at the far end with her hands folded, and a woman introduced as outside legal counsel for executive personnel matters. The air in the room felt arranged, the way a scene feels when everyone in it already knows the script except you. Victoria did not stand when he entered. She slid a folder across the table without preamble, and inside it Nolan found 4 documents organized in sequence. A resignation letter effective as of 6 o'clock that morning, a systems access termination agreement, a transition handoff memo addressed to his deputy, and a notice already circulated to the board, informing its members that Nolan Briggs had voluntarily stepped down from his role as director of plant operations. The resignation letter listed his reason as a desire to focus on family obligations. At the bottom of each page was a digital signature that appeared, at first glance, to be his own. He recognized it immediately as the electronic mark he had used 6 months earlier on an internal transfer authorization. The curve of the capital N, the compressed loop at the end, and the recognition arrived not as confusion but as a cold, clarifying certainty. Victoria told him she understood this was abrupt, and that she wanted to make the transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. She outlined the terms she was prepared to offer: 1 full year of base salary, continuation of family health coverage, a letter of recommendation she had already drafted, and a confidentiality agreement covering both his departure and any knowledge of the pending acquisition discussion. In exchange, he would not contest the resignation, would not attempt to attend the board meeting scheduled for that afternoon, and would refrain from communicating with board members, union representatives, or the press regarding any aspect of the company's strategic direction. Nolan sat with the folder open in front of him and read every line before he said anything. He told her he was declining. He told her that she had not simply taken his job. She had used his daughter as a reason for a decision he had never made, and that was a different kind of violation, one he was not prepared to absorb quietly. Victoria said the signature was on file, and he would have difficulty proving otherwise through any process that could be resolved before the board vote. Her tone was not cruel. It was the tone of someone who had already calculated the odds and found them comfortable. Nolan stood, straightened his jacket, and looked at the woman who had just tried to erase 16 years of his life with paperwork. He said, "You just fired the wrong man." He was escorted out by 2 members of facility security, while colleagues he had known for years watched from the corridor, none of them knowing what had happened. Before he reached the parking lot, his phone rang. It was Grant Wexford, the company's lead attorney, and his voice was low and urgent. He told Nolan not to leave the property. He said there was something about Nolan's voting rights that the CEO did not know. 3 days before the morning his badge stopped working, Nolan had been sitting at a workstation in the plant operations center at 7:30 in the evening. Going through production data he had pulled specifically because something in the quarterly performance report Victoria had circulated to the board did not match what he was seeing on the factory floor. The report characterized both of Vanguard Sterling's primary manufacturing facilities as operating at a loss, framing them as liabilities that were dragging down the company's overall financial position and making it difficult to attract acquisition interest at a favorable valuation. But the numbers Nolan was looking at told a different story entirely. Incoming orders were up 11% over the prior year. Raw material costs had dropped after a renegotiated supply contract he had personally managed. A newly installed processing line was within 90 days of reaching full production capacity, and the losses listed in the report were concentrated almost entirely in a category labeled restructuring and advisory fees. He dug into the advisory fees. What he found was that the bulk of those costs, documented across 4 separate consulting agreements, had been paid to firms that shared addresses, personnel, or ownership structures with entities connected to Sebastian Blackthorne's investment network. The losses being used to justify selling the company had been manufactured, at least in part, by paying money to organizations controlled by the buyer. It was a mechanism Nolan had studied in business school case histories, but had never expected to encounter at a company he had helped build from the production floor up. He printed the documentation, locked it in his desk, and spent the following 24 hours working with his operations team to draft a count proposal. The plan Nolan assembled with his team over those 2 days was unglamorous but functional. It involved selling a parcel of industrial land adjacent to the North facility that had not been used in 12 years and had appreciated significantly in value, renegotiating the terms of the company's primary revolving credit line with the help of a regional bank that had financed Vanguard Sterling decades earlier, suspending executive bonus disbursements for 2 quarters, terminating the 4 external consulting agreements that had been generating the false losses, issuing a class of preferred shares reserved for long-tenured employees, and allowing the new processing line to reach profitability before any structural decisions were made. The plan would not make anyone rich quickly and would not produce the kind of immediate valuation spike that brought investment bankers to the table, but it would keep the factories running and keep 3,000 people employed. When Nolan brought the counter-proposal to Victoria, she dismissed it within minutes. She told him he was thinking like an engineer and not like a capital markets executive, and that the window for a deal of this magnitude would not stay open indefinitely. He told her that a factory generating real orders for real products should not be classified as a failure simply because someone needed it to look unprofitable on a particular deadline. The meeting ended badly. Victoria told him clearly that he was not to present his alternative plan directly to any board member, and that any attempt to do so would be treated as insubordination. Nolan told her just as clearly that he had already been invited by one member of the board to present his findings. What he did not know was that hours after that conversation, Sebastian Blackthorne called Victoria on a private line and told her that Nolan had to be removed from the picture before the board meeting. Sebastian explained the consequences of failure with the kind of quiet precision that leaves no room for misunderstanding. If the deal collapsed, his fund would withdraw, Victoria's performance bonus would disappear, the promised seat at the top of the merged corporation would go to someone else, and the board would eventually learn about the adjustments that had been made to the financial reports. Victoria ended the call and told Curtis Bellamy to find a way. Curtis found what Victoria needed in a personnel file from 6 months earlier. He discovered a transfer authorization form bearing Nolan's electronic signature, a routine document from a temporary staffing adjustment that had been processed and forgotten. Victoria's instruction was direct. Change the document's title and category in the system. Apply Nolan's signature to a new form. Date it for 6 o'clock that morning, and record the departure reason as voluntary separation for family reasons. Curtis knew what she was asking. He processed it anyway. And that processing, that single act of compliance, set in motion something neither of them had anticipated. Victoria Carrington had not arrived at Vanguard Sterling Industries as a villain. She had arrived 3 years earlier as a solution. The company had been bleeding cash after a failed product expansion. 2 of its largest clients had reduced their contracts simultaneously, and the board had been watching its stock price erode for 18 consecutive months when it brought her in from a private equity background to do what she had done twice before at other manufacturers: stabilize the finances, cut the weight, and restore confidence. She had done exactly that. Eliminated a division consuming resources without results, renegotiated 3 vendor contracts, and returned the stock to a level that allowed the company to refinance its debt at better terms. The board gave her full operational authority and very little interference, which was the way she worked best. Nolan had not been her enemy during those early years. They had operated in a relationship built on professional respect rather than personal warmth. He handled the physical reality of manufacturing, and she handled the financial architecture above it, and for a time the arrangement functioned well. The friction began when Victoria's priorities shifted in ways that Nolan recognized before most of his colleagues did. Safety inspection intervals were extended, production schedules were compressed beyond comfortable margins, employee benefit packages were quietly restructured, and a series of high-cost consulting relationships were established with firms whose value to the company was not apparent to anyone who worked on the plant floor. When Nolan raised concerns in leadership meetings, Victoria acknowledged them and moved past them. When he raised them in writing, she responded with documentation that reframed his objections as resistance to necessary modernization. He was not fired, but he was increasingly excluded from decisions he had previously been included in. Sebastian Blackthorne had identified Vanguard Sterling not because he wanted to run a manufacturing company, but because he wanted what a manufacturing company accumulated over decades: patents, real estate, brand equity, and workforce infrastructure. His plan was to acquire the company at a depressed valuation, hold the patents and license them to offshore producers, sell the manufacturing facilities and the industrial land beneath them, redirect existing orders to lower-cost suppliers, and use the Vanguard Sterling name for approximately 3 years before retiring it. The transaction was structured to maximize short-term asset extraction rather than long-term operational value, and it would generate significant returns for everyone positioned correctly on the financial side, while eliminating the livelihoods of thousands of people who had spent their working lives building something they believed was meant to last. Victoria understood the trade-off. She told herself it was a necessary one. She told herself that some portion of the company would survive in restructured form, that the deal was the only alternative to a slower collapse, and that someone with less experience would make the same decision less competently. She had spent 3 years earning that board's trust, and she had earned the right to make hard calls. The contract Sebastian had arranged for her included $15 million in completion bonuses, a chief executive position at the combined entity, a discounted options on preferred shares, and a release from liability for any restructuring decisions she had made during her tenure. It was not a bribe. It was structured to look like a reward. She had chosen not to examine the distinction too closely. What no one had told Victoria, what she had not thought to investigate, was that Marissa Langley, the company's chief financial officer, had spent the better part of 6 months documenting the irregularities she had been asked to incorporate into the financial statements. Marissa had not yet decided what to do with what she had found. She was a practical woman who understood that careers in corporate finance could be ended by the people you accused as easily as by the accusations themselves. But she had kept records with the meticulous thoroughness of someone who suspected she might one day need them. The afternoon Nolan was escorted out of the building, Marissa pulled those records from a personal drive and read through them again. Grant Wexford met Nolan in a small conference room at the law offices his firm maintained 2 blocks from the Vanguard Sterling campus, neutral ground, technically outside company jurisdiction, and far enough from the main building that no one would observe the meeting from the lobby windows. Grant had served as the company's lead attorney for 11 years, and in that time, he had learned to read corporate documents with the particular attention of someone who understood that the most consequential provisions were almost never the ones that appeared in the summary materials. He had reread the Sterling Employee Legacy Trust documentation 3 times that morning before picking up the phone. The trust had been established 7 years earlier by Eleanor Sterling, the 69-year-old daughter of Vanguard Sterling's founder, in one of the last significant governance actions she had taken before stepping back from an active board role. The structure was unusual. Rather than a conventional shareholder agreement, the trust held a dedicated block of shares, 17% of the company's total equity, with voting rights enhanced to 24%, specifically for a defined category of consequential decisions. Those decisions included any transaction involving a controlling interest in the company, closing any operating facility with more than 200 full-time employees, modifying core employee benefit structures, or electing a chairman of the board during a period the charter defined as a governance crisis. Eleanor was the trust's primary representative. The document named a backup representative who would assume full authority in the event that Eleanor was unable to attend or was incapacitated. Nolan Briggs. Nolan remembered signing something with Eleanor's name on it 7 years earlier. He remembered being told it was part of a program to formalize employee representation in long-term strategic decisions, and that his role was largely ceremonial. He would be consulted on major workforce matters. His signature would be kept on file as a procedural formality, and it was unlikely he would ever be called upon to act in any formal capacity. Eleanor had said it with the gentle assurance of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why, even if the other person in the room did not. She had chosen him after an incident 11 years earlier, when a defective equipment batch had threatened a major product recall, and Nolan had refused to help leadership conceal the fault, forcing a public disclosure that was costly in the short term and quietly company-saving in the long one. Eleanor Sterling did not arrange things carelessly. Grant explained why the trust mattered that afternoon. Eleanor was in treatment at a facility outside the state and had formally notified the trust administrators that she could not attend or participate in the scheduled board meeting. A notification she had submitted, Grant noted quietly, 48 hours before Victoria's team had finalized the resignation paperwork for Nolan. That sequence mattered. The trust's anti-interference clause stated explicitly that if any officer of the company took action to remove or sideline the designated backup representative within 30 days of a scheduled vote covered by the trust's protected category, the voting rights of the chief executive and any officer who had participated in that action would be automatically suspended pending board review. Victoria had not known about the clause. Curtis had not known to look for it. The forgery that was supposed to keep Nolan out of the room had instead triggered the mechanism that would let him walk back in with more authority than he had ever possessed as an operations director. Nolan sat quietly for a long moment after Grant finished speaking. He said he did not want this to become a personal campaign, that his goal was to protect the factories and the people who worked in them, not to pursue a woman whose career had taken a wrong turn in a direction she might not fully return from. Grant said he understood, but that the choice had already been made for both of them. If Nolan walked away, the trust's protections dissolved. The board vote proceeded under suspended rights rules that favored the acquisition. Victoria would formalize the fraudulent resignation after the deal closed. The factories would be sold, 3,000 jobs would be gone, and no one would ever know what the charter had been designed to prevent. Grant reached into his jacket and produced a board-level access credential on a lanyard Nolan recognized from governance meetings he had attended years earlier in a different capacity. He placed it on the table between them without ceremony. He said, "You're not walking back in as an employee. You're walking back in as the person who holds more votes than the CEO." The board meeting had been called to order at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Victoria had opened it by informing the assembled members that Nolan Briggs had voluntarily stepped down from his position that morning for personal and family reasons. She delivered the news with practiced composure, framing it as a natural transition that reflected his long-standing commitment to his daughter, and she moved quickly past it toward the presentation materials for the Blackthorn acquisition. The speed of the pivot was deliberate. She wanted the resignation to register as settled before anyone thought to question it, wanted the absence of Vanguard Sterling's most outspoken operational skeptic to feel unremarkable before the vote began. Sebastian Blackthorn sat in the room in a designated observer's chair, his posture carrying the relaxed certainty of someone who had already counted the outcome. The door opened at 12 minutes past 2. Grant Wexford entered first, which was unusual but not alarming. The lead attorney occasionally joined board sessions for governance agenda items. The room's attention shifted when Nolan appeared behind him. He was dressed the same way he had been dressed that morning, in the same dark jacket he had worn to what was supposed to be his last hour in the building, and he walked to the far end of the conference table and stood rather than sat, the stance of someone who understood he had not yet been given a place at the table and was not going to pretend otherwise. Victoria's expression moved through surprise and into something harder in the space of 2 seconds. She asked, in a voice that was professionally level, why he was in the room, and told the security officer stationed by the door to escort Mr. Briggs from the building. Grant spoke before anyone moved. He announced that Nolan Briggs was present in his capacity as acting representative of the Sterling Employee Legacy Trust, that the trust's governing documents gave him full standing to attend and participate in any vote covered by the trust's protected categories, and that the action taken earlier that day to remove him from company premises constituted a triggering event under the anti-interference clause, automatically suspending the voting rights of the chief executive pending board review. The room went very quiet. Franklin Rhodes, the vice chairman, asked Grant to clarify which clause he was referencing. Grant read the relevant section aloud from a document he had brought in printed form and distributed to each board member present. Victoria said Nolan had resigned voluntarily, and that his separation from the company had no bearing on trust representation. Nolan asked the board to request a complete audit log of the digital signature associated with the resignation document. Specifically, the timestamp of its creation, the account from which the document had been originated, and the original source file from which the signature data had been extracted. He did not raise his voice. He did not use the word forgery. He asked the board to look at the log and suggested they would find it informative. While the technology team initiated that review, Nolan presented his counter-proposal. He had the 47 pages of materials with him, and he had printed copies for every member. He did not begin with the accusation against Victoria. He began with the factories. He walked through the actual production numbers, the order pipeline, the real cost structure, the new processing line's projected output, and the source of the losses that had been used to justify the sale. He showed the board the advisory fee agreements and the corporate relationships connecting them to Sebastian's investment network. He showed them what a profitable facility looked like when its financial reporting had not been adjusted to serve a particular conclusion. A number of board members who had arrived that afternoon, intending to vote in favor of the acquisition, began reading the materials in front of them with an attention they had not previously applied to the documents Victoria's team had distributed. Sebastian interrupted to observe that Nolan's background was in plant operations rather than capital markets, and that his understanding of the deal's structure was necessarily limited. Nolan looked at him directly and said, "That may be true, but I know enough to recognize that a factory producing real revenue should not be described as a failure simply because someone needs the land it sits on." Under the table, Nolan's phone lit up with a message from Marissa Langley. It read, "I have documentation showing the financial reports were altered, but if I come forward, I may lose everything." The technology team confirmed the audit log findings within 40 minutes. The digital signature on the resignation document had not been applied by Nolan Briggs at any point in the 24 hours preceding his removal from the building. In fact, it had not been applied by any account associated with him at all. The signature data had been extracted from a transfer authorization form Nolan had signed 6 months earlier and embedded into the new document, which had been created from the CEO suite using an administrative access level that bypassed the normal workflow approval chain. The document had been dated and time-stamped to reflect an effective separation of 6 o'clock that morning. Curtis Bellamy had applied a verification seal the system logged as human confirmed. There were no records of Nolan logging in, no records of him accessing the HR portal, and no records of any communication from him expressing an intention to resign. Victoria told the board that administrative processing errors were not uncommon in complex personnel transactions, and that the appropriate venue for addressing them was an internal review process rather than an active board session. She suggested that the technology team's findings, while worth examining, were preliminary and should not be used to disrupt a time-sensitive governance matter. Franklin Rhodes asked her to clarify who had authorized the creation of the document and the application of the administrative access credentials. Victoria said the process had involved multiple parties, and she would need time to reconstruct the sequence accurately. Franklin said they had time, and he would like to wait while she did so. The silence that followed was the kind that reshapes rooms. Curtis Bellamy was sitting near the door. He had attended the session as an observer, as HR directors sometimes did during personnel-adjacent board discussions, and he had spent the last hour in a state of deteriorating composure that anyone watching him would have recognized as a man working through a decision he had not yet committed to. Victoria looked at him from across the room with an expression that communicated, clearly and without words, that she expected him to confirm the document had been processed in good faith as part of a standard separation workflow, and that any anomalies were attributable to a technical error he had failed to catch. Curtis looked back at her, then he looked at Nolan. Nolan did not look away. Curtis told the board he had been instructed by the chief executive to locate a document bearing Nolan's electronic signature and to use that signature as the basis for a new termination agreement. He told them he had been directed to change the document's title and category in the system so that it would process as a voluntary resignation rather than an administrative transfer. He told them he had known Nolan had not submitted the resignation voluntarily, that he had processed the document anyway, and that he understood what the consequences of that statement were for his own position. Victoria said she had acted in the interest of the company's long-term stability, and that the acquisition represented the most viable path forward for all stakeholders. Nolan asked her a single question. If the deal is as strong as you say it is, why did you need to forge a signature to protect it? No one answered. Nolan had spoken privately with Marissa before the session resumed, and he had told her something she had not expected to hear from someone in his position, that he would not ask her to absorb the consequences alone, that whatever exposure the disclosure created for her career, he would work to mitigate through the board's formal protection process, and that her documentation would be entered into the record, with her name attached as someone who came forward voluntarily rather than under compulsion. She walked to the front of the room. Marissa presented the original factory performance data before adjustments, alongside the adjusted version that had been distributed to the board, a record of the advisory fee payments and their recipients' corporate affiliations, an email exchange between Victoria and Sebastian Blackthorne, confirming Victoria would receive a completion bonus upon closure, and a separate document showing that 3 members of the board had received private financial commitments from entities within Sebastian's investment network contingent on the vote passing. Franklin Rhodes asked the board's legal counsel to review the charter's provisions on conflicts of interest. The review did not take long. Franklin Rhodes asked the sitting board chairman, a man named Douglas Merritt, to confirm whether he had received any financial commitment, direct or indirect, from any entity associated with Blackthorn Dominion Capital or any of its affiliated funds. Douglas said the question was outside the appropriate scope of a board session and that he would address it in a proper forum. Franklin told him the charter was quite specific. An officer or board member with a material financial interest in the outcome of a vote was required to recuse from that vote and, if the interest had not been previously disclosed, to submit to a review of their fitness to continue serving. He asked the question again. Douglas said nothing. Franklin said, "Your silence is a disclosure. Under the Charter's governance crisis provisions, a chairman subject to a conflict of interest review could not continue to preside while that review was pending." Douglas Merritt was effectively suspended from his role the moment the review was formally requested, which left the board without a presiding officer and triggered the Charter's requirement to elect a temporary chairman before any substantive business could continue. Victoria moved to nominate a third-party governance consultant she had used during a previous restructuring. Franklin pointed out that the consultant's firm had been retained by one of the advisory companies identified in Marissa's documentation. The nomination failed before it reached a vote. Eleanor Sterling appeared on a screen at the far end of the room. She was seated in what appeared to be a hospital suite, but her voice was clear and her instructions were precise. She said she had been following the session through the Trust's Observer Access channel and that she had a nomination to place before the board. She nominated Nolan Briggs as temporary chairman. The objections came quickly from 3 members who had not yet been identified as having conflicts. One said Nolan had never served on a board. One said he lacked the capital markets experience required to manage a transaction of this complexity. One said elevating an operations director to the chairmanship during an active governance crisis was the kind of decision that invited regulatory scrutiny. Nolan did not argue with any of them. He told the board that if they preferred a fully independent outside chair who could be identified and verified within 24 hours, he would support that choice, provided the person had no prior relationship with Blackthorn's network and was committed to conducting a full audit before any vote on the acquisition. He said he was not asking for the position. He said if the board chose him, he intended to use the role to clean the record, and nothing else. Sebastian told the room, in the unhurried tone of someone recalibrating rather than panicking, that Blackthorn Dominion Capital had provided bridge financing to Vanguard Sterling at a time when no other institutional lender had been willing to step in, and that the terms of that financing included an accelerated repayment trigger in the event that a board vote on the acquisition was blocked or significantly delayed. He said the trigger would result in a demand for full repayment of $180 million within 30 days, and that he wanted the board to understand the practical implications before it made any procedural decisions. He looked directly at Nolan when he finished speaking. The vote for temporary chairman was conducted under the suspended voting rights protocol Grant had invoked. Victoria and the 3 identified conflict members did not vote. The Trust's 24% block went to Nolan. Franklin voted for Nolan. 2 independent board members voted for Nolan. The pension fund proxy, designated to a financial institution with no ties to the Blackthorn network, voted for Nolan. The result was not close. Nolan walked to the head of the table. He had spent his entire career in that building going through the side entrance, parking in the employee lot and sitting in the subordinate chairs along the wall of rooms like this one. He did not move quickly. He did not allow himself any expression that could be read as triumph. Victoria Carrington watched the man she had escorted out of the building 6 hours earlier take the seat she had occupied for 3 years, and she did not look away. He said, "The first order of business for this board is to restore accuracy to the record." Sebastian's warning about the debt repayment trigger was not empty. By the following morning, Blackthorn Dominion Capital had served Vanguard Sterling with a formal demand notice citing the acceleration clause in the bridge financing agreement. And the number on the notice was exactly what Sebastian had announced in the boardroom: $180 million, payable within 30 days. The timing was precise. He had been prepared to deploy this tool the moment the acquisition vote was disrupted, and he had positioned the debt as a weapon designed to force the company to choose between cooperating with him or collapsing under its own leverage. 3 of the company's largest suppliers received anonymous advisories suggesting that Vanguard Sterling's financial stability was in question, which was enough to prompt 2 of them to request accelerated payment terms on outstanding invoices. The stock price fell 9% when trading opened the next day. Victoria, suspended from her operational duties pending the board's investigation, sat in a conference room watching the same news feeds as everyone else, and observed that this outcome was exactly what she had been trying to prevent. Nolan did not spend the day in the chairman's office. He spent it in a series of back-to-back sessions with the people he knew how to work with. Marissa took the financial lead, working through the company's actual liquidity position and identifying the gap between what was genuinely owed and what could legitimately be challenged on procedural grounds. Grant examined the acceleration clause for the standard carve-outs that most sophisticated financing agreements included. Provisions restricting a lender's ability to demand accelerated repayment if the lender had engaged in fraudulent conduct in connection with the original transaction, or if the repayment demand was being deployed in coordination with an attempt to manipulate a governance process. Franklin managed the board's internal communications, keeping members informed without creating additional panic. Nolan called the plant managers at both factories and told them directly that the facilities were not closing and that he needed operations to remain stable while the financial situation was resolved. The examination of the acceleration clause produced 3 viable arguments that Grant believed could sustain a legal challenge long enough to prevent immediate enforcement. More importantly, the discovery process that a legal challenge would initiate would require Blackthorn Dominion Capital to produce records of its internal communications regarding the acquisition. Records that, based on what Marissa had already provided, were likely to contain evidence of the coordinated effort to manipulate the company's financial reporting. Sebastian knew this. The demand notice was designed to create panic, not to survive a legal contest. The question was whether the company could stabilize its cash position long enough to make the call. The answer came from an unexpected direction. A regional bank that had financed Vanguard Sterling's original expansion 2 decades earlier agreed, after a 4-hour conversation with Marissa and 2 plant managers, to provide emergency bridge financing at terms considerably better than the Blackthorn loan, contingent on the outcome of the audit. The industrial land parcel that Nolan had identified in his counter-proposal, a 30-acre tract adjacent to the north facility that had appreciated substantially over 12 years of non-use, was appraised and entered into a sales process the same week. 3 of the most expensive consulting agreements were terminated by the end of the day, releasing funds that had been flowing out of the company without producing anything the operations team could identify. The factories kept running. Nolan drove home at 11:30 that night and found his daughter awake on the living room couch, doing homework under a reading lamp the way she always did, when she was actually thinking about something other than her schoolwork. She asked him if he had gotten his job back. He told her it was something larger and something less certain, and that he was not sure how long it would last. Sadie asked him whether he wanted it. He sat down next to her and thought about the question honestly, which she always expected him to do. He said, "I want the company to survive. The chair is just where they put me to do that." She nodded and went back to her reading, which was her way of saying she understood. Victoria requested the meeting herself the following morning. She sent a message through Grant asking for 30 minutes alone with Nolan. No attorneys, no board observers, no record. Nolan agreed to the first two and declined the third. The conversation would be logged, he told Grant, or it would not happen. Victoria accepted the condition. They met in the same small conference room, on the ground floor where she had placed the forged resignation in front of him 4 days earlier. She told him she had documentation he needed. She had an email chain from Sebastian outlining the specific mechanism for cutting off supply to the company's primary component vendor, a vendor whose ownership Sebastian had quietly acquired through a subsidiary 6 months earlier, positioning himself to disrupt Vanguard Sterling's production lines as a coercion tool if the acquisition was threatened. She had a full copy of the completion bonus agreement, showing her terms and the terms of the 3 board members who had been identified in Marissa's materials. She had a recording of the phone call in which Sebastian had instructed her to eliminate Nolan from the process before the board vote. In exchange for providing the documentation, she asked Nolan to advocate for a reduced disciplinary finding, to allow her to resign with a neutral employment statement rather than a termination record, and to keep the forged resignation out of any public disclosure. Nolan told her he could not make the third commitment. He told her the forgery was part of the company's governance record and had already been certified as evidence in a proceeding that was no longer solely within Vanguard Sterling's control. It had been reported to the state attorney's office by Grant's firm, and withdrawing it was not within his authority. He told her the first 2 requests were things he would genuinely consider, that he believed in proportional accountability rather than destruction, and that her cooperation at that point, though it came later than it could have, still had value and would be documented as such. Victoria looked at him for a long moment before she answered. She said she had told herself, every time she made a decision that moved her further from the person she had initially intended to be, that it was necessary, that the scale of what was at stake justified the method. She said she had grown up in a family where failure was treated as evidence of permanent inadequacy, and that 3 years of rebuilding a company from a genuine crisis had become, somewhere along the way, indistinguishable from proving something to people who had never thought she was enough. Sebastian had offered her the largest stage she had ever been offered, and she had told herself the cost was acceptable. Nolan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You didn't lose your position because you wanted to succeed. You lost it when you decided no one else got to choose." The supply chain disruption Sebastian had planned was neutralized within 48 hours, using the information Victoria had provided. A regional court granted an injunction blocking the subsidiary's ability to modify existing supply agreements pending the investigation, and the emergency bank financing allowed the company to accelerate payment on outstanding invoices to suppliers who had been made nervous by the earlier reports. The factories did not stop. Sebastian's last piece of leverage dissolved in a courtroom without drama. The formal board vote, conducted 3 weeks later after the independent audit was completed, removed the acquisition from consideration entirely, terminated the contracts of the 3 conflict-identified board members, accepted Victoria's resignation in lieu of formal dismissal, confirmed Nolan as chairman with a 1-year review clause at his insistence, and appointed Marissa Langley as interim chief executive. Nolan accepted the chairmanship on one condition: that the board vote on whether to renew it after 12 months, and that the vote include a formal assessment from the company's workforce representatives. 1 year after the morning his badge stopped working, Vanguard Sterling Industries was not the company it had been when Victoria arrived, and not the company Sebastian Blackthorne had tried to acquire. It was something smaller in ambition and more reliable in practice. Both factories were running, the workforce was intact, the patents remained in the company's control, and the financial statements reflected numbers that the people who operated the facilities could actually recognize as true. The electronic signature system had been rebuilt with a protocol requiring physical dual authorization for any separation document involving a senior employee. The board had adopted a standing rule that no decision affecting more than 50 employees could be finalized without a session that included direct workforce representation. Neither change generated headlines, but both of them mattered to the people they were designed to protect. Sebastian Blackthorne lost the acquisition. His fund faced regulatory scrutiny over the coordinated financial reporting manipulation, and 3 institutional investors withdrew their commitments while the investigation proceeded. The debt position he had used as leverage against Vanguard Sterling was sold to a secondary market buyer at a significant discount, in part because the legal challenges had made its enforceability uncertain. He retained his other holdings and his standing in some quarters, but the campaign to acquire Vanguard Sterling had cost him more than the deal was ever worth, which was perhaps the only satisfying arithmetic in the entire affair. Victoria lost the chief executive's position, the completion bonus, and the title she had been promised at the top of the merged corporation. She cooperated with the attorney's office review and received a settlement that limited her formal liability without eliminating it from her professional record. She was prohibited from holding any executive role at Vanguard Sterling for 5 years. The severance she had originally offered Nolan, 1 year of salary, health coverage, a letter of recommendation, was, in the end, roughly equivalent to what she received from the company in a separation agreement negotiated on her behalf. The symmetry was not something anyone noted publicly, but Nolan was aware of it. The most significant consequence she faced was not legal. Her career record, which had been impeccable for 2 decades, was now permanently marked by the document she had used to try to erase someone else. Nolan continued driving his old pickup to the campus every week. He instituted a monthly open-floor session at both facilities where any employee could ask him questions directly, without management intermediaries, without prepared answers. He funded a training program for young engineers named after the equipment safety disclosure he had forced 11 years earlier, the decision that had made him temporarily unpopular with leadership and had ultimately led Eleanor Sterling to believe he was the right person to hold the trust. He transferred a portion of the trust's voting rights to a formal employee advisory council and retained his own representative block only for decisions that could not be resolved through the council process. He returned to the ground floor conference room one afternoon to collect the original forged resignation document after the investigation had concluded and the evidence hold was lifted. Curtis Bellamy handed it across the same table where it had been placed in front of Nolan the morning everything changed. He read the line at the center of it one final time, voluntarily stepping down to focus on family. Sadie was waiting in the car outside to drive to her school's spring event. Grant asked him whether he wanted the document filed in the company's legal archive or destroyed once the case was fully closed. Nolan folded the paper and said, "Keep it in the management training program, so the next person who sits in this chair remembers that a signature doesn't give you the right to write someone else's story." He left on time to be with his daughter. In the hallway outside, a new employee looked up from a tablet and said, "Chairman Briggs." Nolan paused at the door and turned back. He said, "On the factory floor, call me Nolan." The conference room behind him was empty now. The chair at the head of the table was still there, the same chair Victoria had occupied, and the same chair he had walked to the morning the vote came in. On the surface beside it, a small plaque had been mounted to the wood. It read, "No decision about people without their voice in the room." The badge that had been deactivated before dawn was the beginning. The plaque was what came after.